In 2010, Alaska's Republican incumbent Senator Lisa Murkowski was in the fight for her political life. She expected to win the Republican primary for her seat, but was upset by ultra conservative lawyer Joe Miller. In a Hail Mary attempt, Murkowski launched a write in bid to keep her in the Senate, something that hadn't been done since Strom Thurmond did it back in 1954. However, against all odds, Murkowski wins re-election to the Senate in one of the strangest U.S. Senate races in recent history. This video is about the 2010 Senate race in Alaska. Hello everyone, welcome to Election History. My name is Dave and I do videos about campaigns, elections, candidates, political parties, and the likes. If you like videos about these subjects, please subscribe to the channel, like and share the video, and comment down below about any possible future video ideas. And a special thanks to today's Patreon producer, Cohen House, actually from Alaska. Thanks, Cohen, for being a History Professor Patreon member. It's people like Cohen who help make this channel possible. If you would like to be a future Patreon producer of a video, please check out my Patreon, which is linked in the description. Now, onto the video. Let's first look at the incumbent Senator Lisa Murkowski. Murkowski is the daughter of former long-serving U.S. Senator and former Governor of Alaska, Frank Murkowski. In 2002, when Frank was still a U.S. Senator with 2 years left in his term, he decided to run for Governor of Alaska, winning by a convincing 15%. Being sworn in on December 2nd, 2002, the new governor was in a position to appoint his successor for his Senate seat. Immediately after this election, there was talk that his daughter, Lisa, was one of those being considered to replace her father, even though she wasn't on the first list of those being considered, according to the media in Alaska. Also included in the list was State Senator Ben Stevens, son of U.S. Senator Ted Stevens. As for Lisa, she didn't have much elected political experience, only just winning her third election to the Alaska House of Representatives the same year that her dad was elected governor. Still, on December 20th, Lisa Murkowski was appointed to fill the rest of her father's term. There would be no special election to fill the term, which meant that Lisa was able to serve as a U.S. Senator without interruption until 2005, which was when Frank's term was to end. During her time in the state legislature, she had a moderate voting record. When it came to abortion, she voted against limiting state funding for abortion. She sponsored increasing the alcohol tax to pay for schools, as well as increased taxes on gasoline and corporations. She also supported strict campaign finance laws. When it came to crime, she supported alternative forms of punishment, as well as education for nonviolent offenders. As for her conservative side, she opposed gun control laws, opening up the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge, or ANWR, to oil drilling, opposed gay marriage, and supported testing in public schools. With her appointment, there were mixed views. Interestingly, most of the positive views came from the Democrats, with former Democratic legislator Kay Brown saying, quote, "I would prefer to see a popular election rather than a dynasty. However, of all the people he could have possibly picked, I am not unhappy with the choice." End of quote. As for Republicans, they were mixed. Republican State Representative Jim Whitaker said, quote, "I think that Governor Murkowski's appointment of his daughter to the United States Senate is nepotism and therefore contrary to the democratic principles of representative government. An action of this type undermines the public trust and is therefore a great concern." End of quote. However, the executive director of the Alaska Republican Party, Randy Rudrich, said that, quote, "Lisa has the leadership skills to represent Alaska immediately in the Senate," end of quote. Another name that was being considered for the seat was Wasilla Mayor Sarah Palin. In the same year that Murkowski became governor, Palin ran for lieutenant governor of Alaska, finishing second place in the Republican primary. After her loss, Palin was an enthusiastic supporter of Murkowski, probably knowing that he would be the next governor and that a U.S. Senate seat might be opened up for her. There were a few possibilities. Either Palin could be appointed outright to the U.S. Senate, or that Lauren Lehman, the person who Palin lost to in the lieutenant governor primary and who would eventually become lieutenant governor, could be appointed to the U.S. Senate by Frank Murkowski, and Palin could be appointed lieutenant governor. But a few days before the announcement of Lisa Murkowski, Palin was told that she was no longer being considered for the position. However, in February of 2003, Palin, now the former mayor of Wasilla, was appointed to the Alaska Oil and Gas Conservation Commission with Randy Rutrich, now the chairman of the Alaska Republican Party. During Lisa Murkowski's time in the U.S. Senate, it was pretty uneventful. Unlike nowadays, where everyone watches her every move, she was just another senator. But she did have to run for her own full term in 2004. Her opponent in that race was Tony Knowles, the former Democratic governor of Alaska. While the nepotism issue was at play, she was being attacked from both the left and the right. Knowles ran ads criticizing Murkowski for opposing purchasing prescription drugs from Canada, and her Republican primary opponent, Mike Miller, former president of the Alaska Senate, saying that she was too liberal. Even with the attacks on both sides, Murkowski was able to easily win the primary with 58.1% of the vote, and then go on to beat Tony Knowles in a mild upset by 3%. John Kerry and the Democrats' underperformance nationwide probably led to Knowles' loss. Had Kerry won, chances are that the momentum would have helped Knowles as well. But it didn't. Murkowski was elected to the Senate for her first full term. As with her first stint in the Senate, her second stint until 2010 was pretty uneventful as well. She was a right-of-center senator, and I don't think that it is a stretch to say that many saw her still as the daughter of Frank Murkowski more than being a senator in her own right. At least that's how I and many that I knew viewed her back in 2010. As for her father, things weren't going well. First of all, he had threatened to circumvent the Alaska legislature by approving an oil pipeline without the legislature's approval. He was eventually stopped by the courts. Another problem that Frank had was that he wanted the legislature to provide money for a jet that would be primarily for his own personal use, as well as being used as a prisoner transport. I mean, that's a pretty fancy prisoner transport plane. Anyway, after the legislature turned him down, he used his own executive power to purchase the plane through the governor's office. On top of that, he supported privatization of public service employees' retirement accounts and other legislation that was deemed unpopular. Still, the pipeline and jet scandal made many consider Frank Murkowski as corrupt and borderlining on authoritarian. When Murkowski was in the U.S. Senate, his approval rating was at 70% in 2001, but in 2005, his approval rating was at 27%, according to a Survey USA poll conducted in May. Now, this is where Sarah Palin comes in. Yes, I know that she didn't run in 2010 for the U.S. Senate seat, but I think that her role in both Alaskan and American politics is extremely important. Personally, I think that Palin is of extreme historical significance, as I see her as the main figure that linked Newt Gingrich's 1994 contract with America conservatism with the MAGA movement of Donald Trump. After being appointed to the Oil and Gas Conservation Commission in early 2003, Palin started filing ethics complaints against Randy Rutrich as he was using his position on the commission to raise money for the Alaska Republican Party. Rutrich would resign from the commission on November 8, 2003, and would later be fined for ethics violations. Now, to give credit where credit is due, Palin was right about this. Rutrich was abusing his position on the board, or at least using it to his advantage. This gave Palin a statewide profile as someone who was fighting against government corruption and wasteful spending, making her look more like a watchdog instead of a politician. In late 2004, Palin and Democratic State Representative Eric Croft called for a formal state ethics investigation into Alaska's Attorney General, Greg Rehnquist, regarding conflict of interest allegations concerning a coal deal the state signed with Taiwan. But this investigation not only focused on the Attorney General, but Frank Murkowski as well. The ethics complaint was dropped against Rehnquist once he resigned from office. With this statewide profile, Palin announced that she was running for governor of Alaska on October 18th, 2005. When she announced, her views on issues weren't far-fetched. As a matter of fact, being both mayor of Wasilla and on the Oil and Gas Commission, she really didn't build an ideological platform for herself. When she announced, she was essentially a clean slate. However, one thing that she was known for was going after Murkowski and other establishment Republicans, causing a rift in the Republican Party. Many considered Palin the least qualified of the Republican candidates to run for governor, which included Frank Murkowski and John Binkley, a businessman and former state senator. But this is when the Democrats in Alaska also made a big mistake. Many assumed that Palin was unelectable in the general election, not because she was a social conservative, which was not uncommon at that time, and Palin really didn't campaign on those issues, but because she had done so much to cause problems in Alaskan Republican circles. The Democrats' assumption was that Palin pissed off so many Republicans that they would vote for former Democratic Governor Tony Knowles in the general election as revenge on Palin. So Democrats were kind of hoping that she would win the primary. She dominated the primary, winning 50.6% of the vote, with Murkowski finishing third. She would easily defeat Tony Knowles by 7%, winning 48.3% of the vote to Knowles' 41%. Palin's campaign showed that the Republican Party had consolidated behind her once she was the nominee. As governor, she had high approval ratings, which led to more Republicans backing Palin. This meant that Lisa Murkowski, who wasn't part of the Palin clique, was starting to be on the outside of the newly forming Republican Party circle. Of course, Palin would run for vice president with John McCain and lose, further increasing her profile in Alaska. She would continue to serve as governor of Alaska, but resigned on July 26, 2009, for what seemed to be no apparent reason whatsoever. Still, there were a number of ethics complaints against Palin during her time as governor, and she was spending too much money on lawyers. Still, she more than likely resigned as governor so that she could build on her national profile. She became an important member of what would be known as the Tea Party movement. Now, I'm going to interject here because I don't think that one can describe the Tea Party movement monolithically. If you ask many, they say that it was a movement that supported economic conservatism based on less spending and lower taxes, as well as a backlash against Obamacare, saying that it was government overreach. But I'm going to give my own opinion and say that I feel that it went a little further than that. In a CBS poll conducted in 2011, 45% of those who identified as supporters of the Tea Party said that they thought Obama was not born in the United States, with a further 21% saying that they did not know. The movement was also into gun rights, with a number of supporters carrying semi-automatic weapons to events. They also opposed the building of a mosque in Manhattan since it was close to the site of the World Trade Center. I'm sorry, but much of the Tea Party support went way beyond just fiscal conservatism. Now we move over to Joe Miller, who self-identified himself as someone in the Tea Party movement. Miller was a lawyer and a federal magistrate judge from Fairbanks, Alaska. When Miller announced that he was running against Lisa Murkowski on April 21st, 2010, he said that he was seeking office because he wanted to stop the country from a, quote, headlong plunge into socialism. End of quote. He said that the national debt had gotten out of hand, which would eventually lead to inflation and unemployment. With that, we have our Republican primary opponents. No other Republicans entered the primary. And with this, we need to remember the split that happened in Alaskan Republican politics. Joe Miller was easily part of the Sarah Palin wing, and Palin would later endorse his candidacy. As for Murkowski, she was part of the old Republican wing of the party that consisted of her father, U.S. Senator Ted Stevens, and Congressman Don Young. While issues were going to be an important part of this election, many outside observers aren't aware of the political fracturing within the Republican Party of Alaska at this time, which was mostly the doing of Sarah Palin. Many people, even today, look at this primary purely through a Tea Party lens, but it goes beyond that. This is the reason I focus more on Sarah Palin, even though she wasn't running, because her ethic complaints from 2003 and 2004 led to the Republican Party being split in Alaska. In May 2010, Miller started to court support from conservatives in both Alaska and Washington, D.C. He was not known by many, and most of the safe money was on Murkowski to win the primary easily. Anchorage pollster Mark Hellenthal said that, quote, "Lisa's not really vulnerable, your gut tells you that, and Miller is not exactly what we would call a household name," end of quote. Still, on May 3rd, Miller announced that he would be holding a fundraiser with Todd Palin, Sarah Palin's husband. The year before, Todd Palin said that he would help out Murkowski since nobody had planned on challenging her, but now with Miller and Todd Palin having a fundraiser together, this signaled a true beginning of Joe Miller's campaign. On June 3rd, 2006, Sarah Palin announced on Facebook that she was endorsing Joe Miller, giving his campaign their first major endorsement. This also signaled to Alaska Republicans that Palin's wing of the party was purely in Miller's camp. At this time, the Alaska Republican Party was still chaired by Randy Rudrich, which was now solidifying behind Murkowski. On June 16th, the Tea Party Express, a political action committee to support Tea Party candidates, endorsed Miller as well, stating that it would spend hundreds of thousands of dollars on radio and television ads supporting Miller and opposing Murkowski. As for Murkowski's campaign, she was getting those in the legislature behind her. On July 8th, 20 members of the state legislature endorsed Murkowski, including House Speaker Mike Chenot and Senate President Gary Stevens. Miller criticized these endorsements, stating that these elected representatives was the problem with the Republicans and a move back to the past. But it wasn't just the endorsements that Miller was criticizing. He was also criticizing Murkowski's votes on the Wall Street bailout, also known as TARP, and Obamacare. This, along with saying that he supported eliminating the Department of Education, as well as phasing out the government out of Social Security and Medicare, made him a fan of the far-right Tea Party supporters in his state. Still, Murkowski was leading in the money race. On July 15th, just a little more than 1 month before the primary, Murkowski had $2.4 million in the bank, with Miller having about $100,000 in his accounts. But a lot of that money was being poured in on behalf of Miller from outside groups such as the Tea Party Express and Sarah PAC, Sarah Palin's own political action committee. But on July 19th, the Tea Party Express's spokesman, Mark Williams, was expelled for posting what he called a satirical letter from the NAACP, which stated, quote, "We colored people have taken a vote and decided that we don't cotton to that whole emancipation thing. Freedom means having freedom to work for real, think for ourselves, and take consequences along with rewards. That is just too far much for us colored people, and we demand that to stop." End of quote. So yeah, remember what I said earlier about the Tea Party movement not exactly being solely focused on economic conservatism? I present Exhibit B along with Exhibit A being the Obama wasn't born in America poll results from earlier. But Murkowski did get some conservative endorsements. On July 29th, the National Rifle Association Political Victory Fund endorsed Murkowski based on her A rating as a member of the U.S. Senate. But for Miller, he was lining up endorsements from all of the major conservatives around the nation, mostly those who worked in the right-wing radio and television space, such as Mark Levin and others. He even received the endorsement of national figures like Mike Huckabee, Jim DeMint, and Michelle Bachmann. But even with national attention, only voters in Alaska could vote in this election. A poll released by Ivan Moore Research on July 25th showed Murkowski with 62% support amongst potential Republican primary voters, with Miller only at 30%. But Miller criticized that poll, as Palin had in the past, saying that it was a Democratic-leaning poll. Just 8 days before the primary, Joe Miller changed his campaign manager, replacing Paul Bauer Jr. with Robert Campbell. But even with this, the Miller campaign was constantly on the attack against Murkowski. As for Murkowski's campaign, they wanted to be clean, refusing to attack Miller on any of his positions. In fact, much of the media reports about Murkowski focus on how she was saying that she was being treated unfairly by Miller. Still, she never really attacked and never really rocked the boat. With the polls looking good, it was probably an exercise in hubris that made the campaign not take Miller seriously. But it wasn't just confidence that was hurting her campaign. The Murkowski campaign came across as looking at the Miller campaign as some kind of minor distraction on their way to victory. Yes, he was annoying, but there was no way that he could win. He didn't have the money behind him, he didn't have the votes behind him, at least according to most of the polls. Also, with the retirement of Ted Stevens, who tragically died in an airplane crash just a few weeks before the primary, but was no longer the U.S. Senator, Murkowski talked about how voting for Miller would be risking her senior senator status. But Murkowski's vote on the Wall Street bailout and Obamacare was being hammered home constantly by Miller, and it was taking its toll. Going into the primary, no one expected anything abnormal. Murkowski was going to win the Senate race, but it could be closer than expected. Yes, Miller could come within 10% of Murkowski, but the incumbent senator was expected to be declared the winner of the Republican primary at the end of the night. But that's not what happened. With 1/3 of precincts reporting by 9:30 p.m., Miller was slightly ahead of Murkowski. By the next evening, the count was still going on, with Miller having a slim 1,686 vote lead out of over 90,000 votes cast. Murkowski vowed to keep fighting, considering that there were thousands of absentee ballots that had yet to be counted, so it was still anyone's game. With that being the case, Murkowski had lawyers ready to challenge any questionable ballots. Now, this is standard operating procedure when it comes to political campaigns. But for Joe Miller, he started claiming that Murkowski was trying to skew the election. Miller's campaign also accused the National Republican Senatorial Committee for trying to influence the outcome in Murkowski's favor without any proof whatsoever. Murkowski would go on to say that Miller was paranoid, supporting conspiracy theories regarding the NRSC and her campaign. But the next day, on August 28th, things would get quite interesting, as it was reported that the Miller campaign had been calling those who had cast absentee ballots to ask who they voted for. Miller's campaign denied the charges. Still, on the day that the absentee and questionable ballots started being counted, Miller claimed that there had been vote tampering, again providing no evidence whatsoever. But after all the votes had been counted, Murkowski was behind and conceded the election on August 31st. Now, Miller was the Republican nominee, running against Democrat Scott McAdams. Nobody had been prepared for the possibility of Murkowski losing to an attorney in Fairbanks who nobody had heard of 6 months earlier. Murkowski called and conceded to Miller, but would not endorse his candidacy. Of course, there was no contingency plan for Murkowski. Even though she had lost the primary election day votes, she was expecting to move ahead with the absentee and questionable votes. That didn't happen. Therefore, what was her next move? Prior to the final results, when Murkowski was in trouble, the Libertarian Party of Alaska was open to having their Senate candidate drop out and put Murkowski's name on the ballot. But after speaking with her early in September, the 5-member executive committee of the Libertarian Party rejected placing Murkowski's name as the Libertarian candidate. The other option was to ask Libertarian candidate David Haas directly if he would allow her to replace him as the candidate. Haas rejected her request on September 13th, just 2 days before the official list of names were to be submitted to the Lieutenant Governor's office to be placed on the ballot. This truly looked like Murkowski's last chance. By this time, the only possibility she had was to run as a write-in candidate. Even before the meetings with the Libertarians, there had been talk that Murkowski was going to run a write-in campaign, simply because many thought that she wouldn't get the Libertarian Party slot on the ballot. Also, because she was expecting to easily beat Miller, she didn't spend as much money on her primary as she should have. Therefore, she still was sitting on $1 million of a campaign war chest. This was more than enough not to just run a campaign, but a well organized operation to help voters understand the write in process. With that, Murkowski re entered the U.S. Senate race as a write in candidate on September 17th, 7 weeks before Election Day. Only one other candidate had won as a write in candidate previously for the U.S. Senate, and that was Strom Thurmond in 1954 in South Carolina. This was to be a momentous task. As for the Republican Party establishment, they were squarely behind Miller now. When Murkowski made her announcement, Republican Senate leader Mitch McConnell said that the Senate Republicans would not support her candidacy. McConnell even sent a $5,000 check to the Miller campaign to reinforce that he was behind Miller and not Murkowski. To further rub salt in the wound, McConnell tried to remove Murkowski as the top Republican on the Energy and Natural Resources Committee, though this was more symbolic as Congress wasn't in session. But the Republicans on the committee voted to keep her in that position. As far as what was happening in the state of Alaska, Randy Rudrich, still the chair of the Alaska Republican Party, said that Murkowski wouldn't receive any support or money from the Alaska Republican Party. Of course, this was understandable as it was the job of a political party to back their nominee, whether they agreed with who that was or not. A political consultant for the Tea Party Express, Sal Russo, said that Murkowski was going to get clobbered. There were a few uphill battles that Murkowski had to deal with. First, in order for her write-in votes to count, voters needed to enter her first and last name, as well as fill in the bubble that was next to her name on the ballot. Luckily for Murkowski, the Alaska Division of Elections office said that the voters didn't need to spell her name exactly correctly, but they did need to fill in the bubble and make it clear that the vote was being cast for Lisa Murkowski. To put this in perspective, the Republicans entered a write-in candidate named Lisa M. Lackey. If the voter simply put Lisa M on the ballot, then the election officials couldn't determine if that was for Lisa Murkowski or Lisa M. Lackey. This is why the intention of the voters, as well as the clarity of the last name, was important. The second uphill battle for Murkowski was the Democratic candidate Scott McAdams. Many expected Miller to win the general election over McAdams, but now Democratic voters were faced with a difficult choice. They could stick with McAdams, which would more than likely mean that Miller would beat Murkowski, or in an attempt to defeat Miller, they could write in Murkowski purely in a Stop Miller movement. These would be the voters that the Murkowski campaign were going to court over the last month and a half of the campaign. When it came to the general election campaign, the questionable positions that Miller had during the primary, which really weren't talked about since the primary was expected to be won by Murkowski, now started to come to light. During the primary, Miller said that he supported eliminating funding to education and getting rid of federal student loans, as well as calling unemployment benefits unconstitutional. Now, things that didn't make it in the light of day during the primary were now front page news during the general election. This was also Murkowski's campaign's opportunity to point out that Miller was truly an extremist on most issues. By the start of October, Miller was getting cocky, tweeting, quote, "Think I'll do some house hunting while I'm in DC. Guess I should pick out some office furniture while I'm in DC. Then there's the matter of a name plaque for my door. My sincere appreciation for the warm welcome, including from future colleagues in DC." But this wasn't the only problem that Miller had with Twitter. After Murkowski had met with the Libertarians about being placed on the ballot, Miller tweeted, quote, "What's the difference between selling out your party's values and the oldest profession? Question." End of quote. With that oldest profession being prostitution. But the problems were about to get worse for Miller. On October 6th, it was reported that when Miller was a federal magistrate, he hired his wife to be his clerk between 2002 and 2004, and once she left the job, she collected unemployment benefits. As a result, Miller was not only accused of nepotism, with reports coming out that Miller actually had to fire his wife for violating federal government nepotism rules, he was also showing that he was hypocritical when it came to his views on unemployment benefits, making it unconstitutional for others while being totally fine for him and his wife. But that was just one bad headline for Miller. The day before, Miller gave remarks in a town hall in Fairbanks saying that the idea of a living, changing U.S. Constitution was bullcrap and that he supported the repeal of the 17th Amendment, the amendment which allowed the direct election of U.S. senators. Scott McAdams said that Miller wanted to repeal the 20th century, while Lisa Murkowski said, quote, "We have seen Joe Miller take some extraordinary positions in this campaign, but I never imagined he would support disenfranchising himself and every other Alaskan. Joe is no longer content with simply taking away federal support from Alaskan families. Now he wants to take away their right to select our U.S. senator." End of quote. Not only was Miller stepping in every landmine that was laying in front of him, he was also biting at the hand that was feeding him. When asked if Miller thought that Sarah Palin was qualified to be president, Miller said that she was constitutionally qualified, not going much beyond that. As a result, Todd Palin, Sarah's husband, sent an email to Miller saying that he should have had a better response considering everything that Palin had done for Miller. This email was leaked and both sides tried to downplay it. Still, everyone knew that there was a rift between the Palins and Miller. And did the problem stop for Miller? Well, no. On October 8th, just 2 days after the reports about his wife receiving unemployment benefits, it was reported that Miller's family also received Medicaid benefits, a system that Miller was campaigning to eliminate. When asked about his hypocrisy, Miller said that his family had struggles in the past. As with his unemployment issue, it came across as if Miller wanted to eliminate benefits for others, but had no problem accepting these benefits for him and his family. Murkowski said, quote, "What I find so hypocritical about Miller is he has stated repeatedly his opposition to these programs, stating that they are unconstitutional. So, if you believe they are so unconstitutional, then why would you avail yourself to these safety nets?" End of quote. With all the criticism that Miller had been receiving about his hypocrisy, he stated on October 11th that he would no longer answer questions about his past. But it didn't matter because the problems kept piling on. Fairbanks North Borough Mayor Jim Whitaker, the same person that I mentioned at the start of this video that claimed that Murkowski's appointment was pure nepotism, said that Joe Miller used public computers for partisan use when he was trying to remove GOP chairman Randy Rudrick in 2008, in which he was disciplined by the borough for ethics violations. And true to their promise, the Miller campaign did not respond to Whitaker's claims. Well, at least not right away. A few days later, Miller said that the allegations were true. The next day after Whitaker's claims, 2 polls came out showing a 3-way race. A Rasmussen poll showed Miller with 35% to Murkowski's 34% and McAdams 27%. The Club for Growth, who was actually backing Miller, also released a poll showing Miller with 33%, Murkowski with 31%, and McAdams again at 27%. Obviously, the negative press was taking a toll on Joe Miller. And honestly, it wasn't getting any better for Miller. Tony Hopfinger, I love that name, the editor of the Alaska Dispatch website, was put in handcuffs and detained by the security detail of Joe Miller. The security detail said that Hopfinger was trespassing at a public event. Yeah, let that sink in for a bit. Anyway, when the Anchorage police arrived, they told Miller security to release Hopfinger. If it couldn't get any worse for Miller, at that same public event, Miller praised East Germany's ability to control its immigration, saying, quote, "If East Germany could do it, we could do it." End of quote. Just a reminder, at least 140 people died trying to leave East Berlin, and many more died trying to leave into West Germany. At this point, it was turning out to be a Miller versus anybody but Miller election. But who was the candidate that was going to benefit from all of the anti-Miller votes? Democrats were worried and even threatened a lawsuit against the state of Alaska for what they saw was the state illegally providing a list of write-in candidates to voters, stating that this was the state politicking for write-in candidates. And they were right to worry because Murkowski was emerging as the only candidate that could knock off Miller. Now, I've talked a lot about the attacks on Miller, but what about the campaigns of Murkowski and McAdams? Well, they really weren't too eventful. Both candidates were swinging at every softball question about every Miller gaffe, which seemed to be coming out daily. As for Murkowski, she continued to educate people about how they needed to write her name for their vote to be counted for the election. For McAdams, he ran a typical campaign, being a centrist candidate, even more centrist than the average Democrat, saying that federal government involvement in Alaska's affairs should be lessened. On election day, nobody knew who the next senator would be. Because Murkowski had a write-in candidacy, the Division of Elections had to verify every write-in vote. But the day after the election, write-in votes were leading both Miller and McAdams in the U.S. Senate race. By November 9th, 1 week after the election, it was becoming clear that write-ins were leading, with 92,528 ballots for write-ins and 81,195 for Miller. Knowing that he was on the verge of losing, Miller filed a lawsuit in federal court stating that only ballots that have Lisa Murkowski's name spelled correctly should be counted as votes for her, citing the Equal Protection Clause of the U.S. Constitution, the same approach that George W. Bush took in his campaign when it came to counting votes in Florida 10 years earlier. However, the federal court decided to let counting continue and only reopen the case if there were federal law violations. Therefore, the federal door was essentially shut on Miller. On November 15, 2010, Murkowski takes the lead in the race, with her write-in votes now surpassing those that were cast for Miller. 1 day later, as Murkowski extended her lead, Miller demanded a hand recount as they claimed that the computers that had tallied the ballots were suspect. Now he was taking a page out of Al Gore's 2000 playbook. But it wasn't just Miller that was trying to challenge Murkowski's total. South Carolina Senator Jim DeMint sent money to Miller, which totaled $627,000 to help with his legal finances. Miller would continue to file lawsuits in Alaskan courts, claiming everything from voter fraud to lack of voter identification to saying that the signatures of voters didn't match, with all of these claims having no evidence whatsoever. On December 10th, the Alaska Superior Court rejected Miller's cases, with the Alaska Supreme Court doing likewise. Any other challenges that Miller brought forward were either rejected outright or just sent back to the lower courts who had already ruled against him. On December 30th, the results of the election were made official, and the Lieutenant Governor, Meade Treadwell, officially certified the election of Lisa Murkowski to the U.S. Senate. The next day, Joe Miller dropped all of his legal challenges and conceded the election. And with that, we are finished with today's video about the 2010 U.S. Senate election in Alaska. If you would like to watch more videos about American elections, you can check out the playlist with a number of other elections as well. If you would like to watch about elections from outside of the United States, try watching this video about the Separatist Party in Quebec. Remember, you can join my Patreon, which is linked in the description below, if you want to get additional benefits like members-only videos. Again, thank you, and I will see you in the next video.